You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
This is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of SLA Insights. We're continuing to look at output and some practical ways to incorporate output into your language classroom. In previous episodes, I've talked about using good questions, the 5 W's and an H, information exchange tasks, information gap tasks. Last week, we had the privilege of hearing from Travis West and how he uses production and performance for output, for encouraging output and language learning. In this episode, we're going to look at our last approach for including output into the classroom and what's known as structured output activities. Now, these have been developed by by James Lee and Bill Van Patten. And if you recall, Van Patten is the one who created the structured input activities, and I covered those in quite a bit of detail in episodes 26 to 34 of SLA Insights. So if you wanted to go back and review the structured input, it kind of has its balance here with the structured output activities. And just like the input activities, there are some guidelines to follow, and some of them will sound familiar if you're familiar with the structured input. So I want to work through these guidelines with you and then provide a specific example of how you might apply the guidelines to your output activities. So the first guideline from Lee and Van Patten is that you present one thing at a time. And again, this should sound familiar if you're familiar with the Van Patten structured input. So you present one thing at a time. This means that you introduce and you review or use in your output activity only one new form meaning connection. In other words, only one part of a paradigm. You're not going to give them the entire perfect consecutive. Okay, you're going to give them the third masculine singular or the second feminine plural. But only one piece of the paradigm are you going to focus on when working through these output activities. It might be instead of new grammar, you're working with new vocab. And if that's the case, just focus on the new vocab or one new syntactical structure. Now, once they've mastered it, you can start adding in more, but make sure your focus is only one at a time. So that's the first guideline. The second one is that you want to keep meaning in focus. Make sure that communication and interaction is a main goal. We're not talking rote memorization here, again, when we're talking output for the purpose of acquisition. Because, and again, I've said this before, acquisition is a byproduct of comprehension. So it's really important that meaning is included in the activity and that the students have to rely on meaning to complete it. The third guideline, then, is that you move from sentences to connected discourse. So you want to start small and build. If you're using Hebrew, for example, you can have an entire sentence in one word. So start there. And then start adding subjects and objects and relative clauses and so on, and build until you've got a larger piece of discourse. But start small and, again, continue gradually building until you have a fuller length text. So that's the third guideline. The fourth is that you want to use both written and oral output. This is going to engage both types of learners, both visual and auditory, but it's also going to engage both types of output skills. And you might want to consider starting with written output. Students have a lot more time to think about it, think about what they want to say. They have more time they can use to revise, to consider alternatives, to look up forms if they need to. And so a written bit of output is a little less threatening in some ways than oral output. But the oral output is important too. Students need to hear the language, and there's something profoundly meaningful and significant when a student can speak spontaneously and get their message across. There's like this light bulb that comes on, they're like, I can do it. And it can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. Consider what Travis West talked about in the last episode about this pedagogy of play, of keeping the stakes low and keeping it fun and engaging so that the risks feel small when they're producing oral output. So that's the fourth guideline, use both written and oral output. The fifth, and this is also really important and something we don't always think about, is that others need to respond to the content of the output. If no one responds to what you say, what was the point of saying it? If it ends up being busy work and it's not very motivating, and it kind of falls flat, like, what did I just do? Why did I do that? What's the point? So make sure that you've got someone responding to the content of the message. Now, it could be you as a teacher, if it's written work and something that they submit to you and you respond to it, but make sure you're responding to the content, okay? A response to output is not the grading of the accuracy of the grammar. It's responding to what the student actually said. So if you're a very thorough grader and you do respond not just to the form, but also the content, then that's fine. But make sure that someone is responding to what the student's saying or writing. Now, keep in mind, a response does not have to be lengthy, and it doesn't even have to be in the language. It can be a nod, a thumbs up. It could be movement. If the student has given a command, another student responds by moving to that command. But in some way, somehow, there needs to be a response to the content of what the student has produced. And then the last guideline here is that the learner has to have some knowledge of the former structure prior to the output activity. And this goes back to what I've been stressing all along through our output discussion, is that input precedes output. It has to. And, it can be just a brief lecture on the structure, but it needs to be more than that. It needs to be some sort of input-based activity where the students have been working on it, reading it, hearing it, choosing different options that include it, whatever, before they try to produce it. And very obviously, they can't produce something they haven't learned, but they really should not be trying to produce something they haven't internalized either. So those are the 6 guidelines for structured output activities, and these are going to overlap with many of the others that I talked about. And these guidelines can offer you a good approach when you're producing any kind of output-based activity to just check through, make sure you've covered all the bases and you're doing it in a way that's going to promote acquisition. So now, for a specific example, let's say that you've decided for your output-based activity, you're going to do an exercise in which the students describe what they will do this coming weekend. So the target structure is going to be the first person singular future tense. So you're looking for things like, I'm going to go into the store, I'm going to go to the movies, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to eat, whatever. So they're plans for this upcoming week. And I'm going to start actually by doing the last guideline first. And the last guideline was that learners have to have some knowledge of the structure before they do output, okay? And again, preferably through some sort of input-based activity. So perhaps you're going to give them a brief explanation of the form and its function, and that's fine, but that's not exactly input, okay? For input activities, you want reading and or listening activities with input that uses the first common singular future perfect, or sorry, future, not perfect. And when I talked about input in previous episodes, I gave some examples there, so I'm not going to review those activities, but you want to be sure that those activities get in there before you ask them to produce the form itself. So that's the first guideline. Make sure they've had exposure to that form before you get to output. The next guideline, I'm going to work through the rest of them then in order. First is one thing at a time. And again, we're just going to focus on first common singular. Don't add in new vocabulary. If you want new vocabulary, introduce that first before you start this output activity. Make sure they know the vocabulary and everything else they need before they start, so you can just focus on the first common singular future. Okay. The second guideline then is that you keep meaning in focus. So you want to focus on communicating those plans for the weekend. What are you going to do? Make sure they're thinking about how to say it, what they're going to do, and so on. So again, keep meaning in focus. Every now and then, yes, correct the grammar if you have to, but you really want to focus on communication. The next guideline is to move from sentences to extended discourse. So this could be a multi-step activity where you get them to start by producing the verbs that they would use. I will go, I will eat, I will look at, whatever those verbs are, so they can focus on just single word sentences, right? And you might even have them write it to start out with. But we'll get to that in just a minute. And then once they've gotten that, then add objects. I will go to my friend's house. I will go to church. I will eat fruit. I will eat meat. Whatever it is that they're going to do, start expanding on those verbs that you've started with. And then by the end, you can put several sentences together. I will go to my friend's house and I will eat fruit. So starting to expand on that, so it's a full discussion of plans for the weekend. The next guideline is that you use written and oral input both. And so again, as I suggested earlier, perhaps you want to start with the writing. Start with, I will go to the store, or, whatever it is. And then later have them present it orally to the class or present it orally to a partner. Something that gets them trying to recall and use almost spontaneously the language. Okay? And then finally, others must respond. And so with this, I have a few ideas, some specific ideas how to get others to respond. The first would be something you would do as an in-class activity before anyone has actually given a full presentation to the class about what they're going to do for the weekend. So what they're going to do is they're going to have perhaps even written down their plans for the weekend. And maybe they submit them to you, the teacher, ahead of time, and you can list all the different plans that people are going to do for the weekend, but not connect them with any particular person, and have the students work together, work around the room, finding the person who is going to go to the store, finding the person who's going to eat fruit, finding the person who's going to go to church, so they can fill out that worksheet and ask each other, of course, in the language, what will you do this weekend? Well, I'm going to, and then they have to find it on their list to see if they can match all those up. So that's one option for using the output in the classroom and getting people to respond to what they're doing. Another idea, and this one would be after the students have presented their weekend plans for the whole class, say they've gotten up in front of the class and said, I will do whatever it is, have them take a poll in the class to give them three options. Say, one, my plans are completely different. I'm not doing any of those things that this person said. Or two, I plan to do some of the same things, but not all the same things. Or three, I will do exactly the same. I have exactly the same plans. Maybe they're live in the same household. But I'm going to do exactly the same things as the person who just spoke. And so that poll, you can kind of take a poll. It's a way of responding to the output that's been given. And then my last suggestion, again, for giving the opportunity for response to what the students are presenting, is to have a Q&A time. So you might ask follow-up questions. Well, if you're going to go to your friend's house, are you also going to go to the movies? What type of fruit will you be eating? Where does your friend live? Those kinds of things to follow up. And again, this could be done whole class, or you could do it, say, in pairs where they each present what they're going to be doing, and the friend has to ask one or two follow-up questions for the output that's been given. So that's one idea for how you could structure an output-based activity and follow all the guidelines that Lee and Ben Patton have presented for what's known as structured output. And so just by quick review, the 6 guidelines are: first, present one thing at a time; 2, keep meaning in focus; 3, move from sentences to connected discourse; 4, use both written and oral output; 5, others must respond to the output in some way; or 6, finally, and importantly, the learner has to have some prior knowledge of the form or the structure before doing the activity, producing the output. So, structured output for today, it's my last practical example of how to incorporate output, how to produce output, and encourage your students to produce output in the classroom. In the next episode, I'm going to kind of wrap up our discussion of output, which we've been doing over the last several episodes, the importance of it, and just kind of do a quick review of what we've learned, how to do it, and how to make use of output, and why we would want to make use of output. So for that review session, I hope you can join me, and I would like you to have a good week in the meantime.
Χαίρετε πάντες, εγώ είμαι η Jesse, και τούτε στην ζών ελληνιστή. Hello everyone, I'm Jesse Orloff and this is Living in Greek. Σήμερον, θέλω ανακοινώσω το δεύτερον κεφάλαιο εκ τις επιστολές προς Θεσσαλονικείς 2. Ανακοινώσκω νυν, αλλά δείχνει την περιοχή. Καλώς. Νυν ανακοινώσκω. Ερωτώ μέντε ημάς, αδέλφιου, υπέρ της παρουσίας του Κυρίου εμών Ιησού Χριστού, και εμών επισυναγωγές επ' αυτόν. Εις το μεταχέος σαλευθένε ημάς από του νοός, με δε θροίστε μέτε δια πνεύματος, μέτε διαλόγου, μέτε δι επιστολές, ως διαιμών, ως ότι ενέστεκεν εμέρα του Κυρίου. Με τις ημάς εξαπατέσε κατά μεδένα τρόπον, ότι εάν με έλτε αποστασία πρώτον και αποκαλυφθέ ο άνθρωπος της ανομίας, ο Υιός της απολίας, ο αντικείμενος και υπεραιρώμενος επί πάντα λεγόμενον Θεόν σέβασμα, ώστε αυτόν εις τον ναόν του Θεού καθίσε, αποδεικνύονται εαυτόν ότι εστίν Θεός. Ου μνημονεύεται ότι αιτιόν προς ημάς ταύτα έλεγον ημίν, και νυν το κατέχον είδατε, εις το αποκαλυφθένε αυτόν εν το εαυτού καιρό. Το γαρ μυστέριον έδε ενεργείται της ανομίας, μόνον ο κατέχον άρτη, έως εκ μέσου γένεται. Και τότε αποκαλυφθέσεται ο άνομος, ον ο Κύριος Ιησούς ανελύει το πνεύματι του στόματος αυτού και καταργήσει τε επιφανία της παρουσίας αυτού, ου εστίν παρουσία κατ' ενέργειαν του σατανά εν πάσε δυνάμει και σεμίους και τέρασιν ψεύδους. και εν πάσε απάτε αδικίας τους απολυμένους, άνθον την αγάπην της αληθείας ουκ εδέξαντο εις το σωθένε αυτούς. Και δια τούτο πέμπει αυτούς ο Θεός ενέργειαν πλάνες εις το πιστεύσε αυτούς το ψεύδι, ή να κριθώσιν πάντες ιούμε πιστεύσαντες τε αληθεία, αλλά ευδοκέσαντες τε αδικία. Εμείς δε οφείλομεν ευχαριστήν το Θεό πάντοτε περί ημών, αδέλφιου, αγαπημένου υπό Κυρίου, ότι ήλατο ημάς ο Θεός απαρχέν εις σωτηρίαν εν αγιασμό πνεύματος και πίστη αληθείας, εις ο εκάλεσεν ημάς δια του Ευαγγελίου εμών, εις περιποιούεσιν δόξες του Κυρίου εμών Ιησού Χριστού. Άρα ουν, αδελφίου, στέκετε και κρατείτε τας παραδόσεις ας εδιδάχθετε είτε διαλόγου είτε διεπιστολές εμών. Αυτός δε ο Κύριος εμών Ιησούς Χριστός και Θεός ο Πατέρ εμών, ο αγαπήσας εμάς και τους παράκλησιν αιωνίαν και ελπίδα αγαθέν εν χάριτι, παρακαλέσε ημών τας καρδίας και στηρίξε εν παντί έργο και λόγο αγαθό. Καλώς. Τούτεστιν το τέλος της αναγνώσεως. Ευχαριστώ ημίν και θέλω απασπάσαστε ημάς. Ερώστε.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.